Hello, everybody. We are on our last set of lectures for anthropology. I want to apologize for this coming in late. My mic is having an issue. It's just tough. But anyways, I have to, I have to re-record. Yeah, it's just like bad. Anyways, yeah, because I thought it was working, and it wasn't working. It doesn't matter. Anyways, yeah. So, yeah, evolution today. We're just going. These are pretty quick. I'm not gonna lie, they're not my favorite topics, so I'm gonna be going over them a little bit quicker than usual. But there are some things I want you to pay attention to in this section. Okay. So, again, the final exam. Oh, sorry. You know what? Let me just pull up some of the. Let me just pull up some of the announcements for you guys this week. So, right? Yeah. Is this the right one? No, it's not. Let me pull it up. Okay. So. Let's go to some announcements right here. All right. So, okay. Remember, this is not your announcements. What the heck? Oh my goodness, everything is going crazy. Okay, so I'm just gonna tell you manually. So basically, the last reflection, I've changed the date for it to be due a day later, which is Saturday, right? The final exam will be available from Thursday, August 3rd, until Monday, August 7th. So you have like 4 days to do it if you need to do it. And then if you need to do it, extra credit will be due on the 8th, which is Tuesday. Okay, we're at the end now. We're at the final stretch. Please only do extra credit if you need it. I'm going to be grading like crazy, so I'll try my best to get everything, but it really depends. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. All right. For the final exam, it'll cover all 4 topics of anthropology. You should, with the post from last time, you should be able to look at your midterm exam. Half of the test is going to be from the midterm. Okay. This exam score, though, is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be 25 points of your grade, or 25%. There'll be 40 multiple choice questions, but they're only going to be worth a quarter of a point each. However, the 5 short answer questions are going to be worth 3 points each. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay. All right. So let's get into the actual content. Let's see. What are some key points of Darwin's perspective, and how is this perspective different from some of the other perspectives? So in this in this section, we're going to be learning about what Darwin thought about evolution, but also what people thought before Darwin, essentially, right? And then we're going to kind of go into that. This stuff is going to be kind of like pretty obvious to you guys because we essentially grew up with Darwin's perspective, but you have to kind of put yourself in the headspace of someone back then. It's not that obvious. You know what I mean? It's only obvious to us now because you've learned it forever, like in this way. Okay. All right. So chapter overview. Chapter objectives. Review how people understand the living world before the 1800s. Understand that evolution is a process of change over time. Examine how Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution, and consider how others have elaborated on Darwin's work since his publication of The Origin of Species. Demonstrate why evolutionary theory is essential to how we understand biological processes today. Okay. So, what is evolutionary theory? Evolutionary theory notes that living species reflect changes over time and space, considers how existing organisms can give rise to new kinds of species, and explains that all species ultimately share a common ancestor, right? So, evolutionary theory, let's go these one by one. It's very straightforward the way I think about it. Look, again, we talked about this at the beginning of the class, like 6 weeks ago. But time and space, right? It sounds complicated. It's not. Chimpanzees today are very different from chimpanzees like 2 million years ago, right? Humans today are very different from our human ancestors, 0.4 million years ago. Okay, so you have to understand that it really depends on when you are looking at the species and where you're looking at the species, because they change as they go. Okay, considers how existing organisms can give rise to new kinds of species, right? How do new species come about? Okay. And finally, explains that all species ultimately share a common ancestor. We're going to talk about this later, but basically all species come from the same ancestor. All right, so how do we know that this is going on? We see material evidence for evolutionary change across time and space in biological variation, genetics, and the fossil record. Okay, so biological variation and the fossil record are kind of related. If you compare again the bones of a dog today versus a dog 1,000 years ago, it's going to be different. If you compare the bones of a human today versus a human 1,000 years ago, they're going to be different, right? So, but you can tell there's biological variation in the species through the fossil record, and of course, there's also looking at genetics, right? All right. So one thing to remember is evolutionary theory is tough. It's testable, unified, and fruitful. A set of independent hypotheses support one another. That's testable. It's unified in the sense that it explains a wide range of material evidence. And finally, it's fruitful because it suggests new possibilities for future research that explains biological diversity. Okay. Now, I have this picture here because I feel like it really encapsulates what Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace was kind of thinking about, right? So Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace explained the pattern of distribution of living species of organisms, such as various species of finches living in Galapagos Islands, by arguing that all variants had evolved from a single ancestral species. So what I'm trying to say with this slide is that essentially, if you look at all these different birds, right, and they look pretty freaking similar, right, but you can tell, right, firstly, that they're the same in the sense that they have a lot of similarities in the way they look. But more importantly, you can also tell they're different, right? Look at the large ground finch compared to the small insectivorous tree finch. While they are related, you can. While they are clearly related, you can also tell they are clearly different, right? They probably, judging from the pictures, have a different diet. They have a different way of moving and everything, right? So I wanted to put this picture up here because I need people to understand that at the time, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace's perspective that that all these different birds or all these different animals come from the same ancestor is a pretty special thought. Okay, it's pretty special, and it's kind of like this image or this kind of comparison between these different birds that to me inspired, like, hey, maybe they are related in some way, even though they're really different. Okay, now how did people look at this before Darwin, though? Right, there was something called essentialism. Living creatures exhibit an unchanging nature. Notion traces back to Greek philosopher Plato, and each kind of organism is sharply distinct from all other kinds. This is essentially when you have an animal, it has a certain kind of quote unquote essence, right? It has a certain type of being, right? Like a tiger essence. Then there's nothing else that's like a tiger, right? And that essence is unchanging; it doesn't change, so that it should be very clear. It should be very clear differences between this animal and other animals. This is obviously not true if you compare a tiger to a leopard to a cheetah to a jaguar. They have a lot of similarities, right? So essentialism obviously isn't real. Great chain of being. Living creatures are created by God and overlap with closely related kinds of creatures. Creatures are ordered by degree of sacredness in an unbroken chain leading to the divine. Encompasses all logically conceivable organisms, arises out of ideas by Greek philosopher Aristotle. Okay, so this one is also pretty straightforward. What this is saying is that God created animals, and the God created animals in terms of how sacred they are. So if you're, I guess, an ant, you're less sacred, and if you are a human, then you're more sacred. Okay, so this one's probably not true either. Now, there are two other ones. Catastrophism. Species become extinct because of natural disasters, and new species heroically appear to replace those who became extinct. This was developed by Georges Cuvier in 1769 to 1832. And the idea behind this one is that, there's catastrophes that happen, and they're like devastating, right? Earthquakes, lava eruptions, whatever, and it gives room for new species to come about. Now, this is not true, but it's an interesting perspective. And the next one is uniformitarianism. This one is an interesting one. I don't really get it too much, but I think it has to do with, the guy that thought of it was a geologist. And so I believe what the geologist was trying to say was that Earth's history, Earth's like physical whatever, like the mountains, the oceans, what they do, it repeats itself all the time, right? And the repetition allows for certain animals to adapt and not adapt, and they die or become new based off of that repetition, right? So the same natural processes that affect the world today worked in the past. The uniformity of these processes allowed the world's history to be constructed, and that's what I think they're talking about. But again, probably it's probably not what it is. Okay. Finally, transformational evolution. This was developed by Jean-Baptiste de Monnet de Lamarck, also known as Lamarckian evolution. Individual living organisms were seen as transforming directly in response to their changing environment. Individual transformations or acquired characteristics were then passed down to offspring. So this one actually, even though it has actually quite a bit of validity here, there are certain well, this one's actually valid, right? So we have some basically what this is saying is that the environment encourages the evolution of it encourages certain types of evolution, and through that encouragement they evolve a little bit faster, and in a certain way, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what makes Darwin's perspective of nature special, right? Variational evolution, theory of common origin, and theory of evolution by natural selection. Okay, so theory of variational evolution is pretty straightforward, right? Emphasize the importance of differences and not similarities within a species. So when we look at the finches, right? When we look at those little birds, like, do we, are we looking at, how should I say this? Are we looking at their similarities or looking at their differences, right? In Darwin's case, it's important to look at the differences because everyone else, like people before them, was looking at their similarities. Okay, so he's looking at the differences. Theory of common origin, we already talked about this. They have a common ancestor, right? So if they have a common ancestor, then they have a common ancestor, period, right? So all similar living species have a common origin. That's just different, right? They just don't think of it that way. And finally, theory of evolution by natural selection. How do new species come about? How do species go extinct? It's through the mechanism known as natural selection. Okay, based off principles of variation, heredity, and natural selection. Great. So we're going to talk about natural selection. We're going to go back to this picture a little bit later, but we're going to talk about natural selection a little more specifically, right? So this was developed by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They both observed that species varied over time and space. Both concluded similar but distinctly descended from ancestral species. And Darwin proposed natural selection over descent with modification of the mechanism for evolution. Basically, this is the same exact thing we just went over. But let's talk about natural selection specifically. So natural selection operates on existing variation within a population. That means that you cannot randomly just sprout wings, right? You are going to whatever happens needs to be within your biological capacity. Like it cannot just happen randomly. Individuals with traits that are best suited to a particular environment will more likely survive and procreate. This is very important. And individuals with the most progeny have superior fitness. So what does this mean? Individuals, the first one means individuals with traits that are best suited to the environment are more likely to survive and procreate, which means in our case have babies, but this could mean a lot of things for different plants and stuff like that, right? So individuals with the most progeny, with the most kids, have superior fitness, right? So what does fitness actually mean, right? A lot of people think about survival of the fittest as like the toughest animal, the animal with the best killer instinct, whatever, right? Well, what it really has to do with is how many successful offspring can you have, right? So unfortunately, you know what a very naturally fit animal is? Cockroaches, right? Because the cockroaches can have babies so fast that you can kill them, and they basically reproduce faster than you kill them, right? Most of them are successful, which again is a very naturally fit animal. Animals that are not naturally fit are basically a lot of the apex predators are not very naturally fit. Lions and tigers, you change their environment a little bit, they don't do well and they die. You know what I mean? But anyway, so when we talk about being naturally fit, when we talk about being survival of the fittest, we're not necessarily talking about their ability to hunt. We're talking about their ability to survive and procreate. Okay. Obviously, when you procreate, the offspring inherit the traits that made their parents fit, right? So if you For example, if you're a cockroach and you're using a bunch of poison and a bunch of the cockroaches eat the poison and die, but you for some reason were smart enough not to eat the poison, your offspring is going to have that biological information to not eat that poison, right? Okay. So traits shaped by natural selection for the function they currently perform. Oh wait, you know what? Let's go back. Or actually, I'll keep going. Traits shaped by natural selection for the function they currently perform are adaptations. Traits that were shaped by natural selection for one function but used for another are exaptations. Any useful trait, regardless of origin, is an adaptation. Exaptations and adaptations may be challenging to distinguish, such as bird feathers, right? So basically, adaptations, and we're going to use the panda example for this. So exaptations and adaptations, what's the difference? In the panda picture, there's a little thumb that they use to eat bamboo, right? So that thumb, was it used? An exaptation would be, an adaptation would be, okay, the panda had problems eating bamboo, or some pandas had this thumb and they used it to eat bamboo and became more effective. They were able to, again, procreate more, have more babies because of this, because they were eating better, whatever. That is an adaptation. Okay, an exaptation would be panda grew this thumb to climb a tree, but instead of climbing a tree, they're using it to eat bamboo. That would be an exaptation. Okay, so it being used for something that it wasn't originally used for is an exaptation. That being said, though, as long as it's useful, it's still considered an adaptation. Okay. The example we have here is bird feathers, right? So are bird feathers, are they used to keep the bird warm, or are they used to help them fly? Who knows, right? All right. So how did biologists learn about genes? Darwin knew something was passed on from parent to offspring. PanGenesis was a theory of heredity favored by Darwin and others. Each parent generated multiple particles reflecting their unique traits. These particles blended in different ways in each offspring. So for this particular one, right, Darwin knew that something was passed on, right, to the kids, but he didn't know what it was. At first, he thought it was PanGenesis, which is basically when your parents' traits mix, right? But as we know today, that's not true. If your mom has blue eyes and your dad has brown eyes, does it come out as some mixture of blue and brown? No, it doesn't, right? So we know now that it does not mix, right? You get one. You end up with one trait, right? But who came out with that? Who found that out? Mendelian inheritance views heredity as based on non-blending single particle genetic inheritance. So Mendel was an Austrian monk who did experiments by breeding his peas at his religious institution, Catholic Church, I believe. It is non-blending single particle inheritance. So basically, when he blended the peas, let's say they were yellow, green, and white. When he would blend them, they wouldn't come out a combination of one or two of them. They would come out as either red, yellow, green, or white. Right. That being said, though, he also found out that there are dominant and recessive traits. Dominant traits are traits that are expressed in an organism that basically you can see them. They're physically noticeable, and recessive traits are not noticeable. So, for example, if there was a green pea and a yellow pea, and their offspring was a yellow pea, and that yellow pea had another offspring with another yellow pea, it could still have a green pea. Does that make sense? So, okay, let me use humans as an example. Might be easier. So let's say brown and let's say brown and blue eyes, right, have a baby and they have blue eyes. Great. Blue eyes and blue eyes have another baby. That baby could still have brown eyes because of the brown eyes trait that your father gave you that was recessive. Does that make sense? So even though you only see one trait, it doesn't mean there's not two of them that exist. It just means that one of them is visible, the other one's dormant, so to speak. Okay. All right. So what are the contemporary basics of genetics? It's not that important. So scientific study of biological heredity emerged almost 35 years after Mendel's work in the early 1900s. So basically, this dude Mendel did all this good work with the peas, but unfortunately, he got no credit until like 4 years later. Genes are the biological unit of heredity, represent a portion of the DNA molecule. Alleles represent all different forms a gene might take. Located on chromosomes. Okay, great. Whatever. Moving on. All right, so key terms in genetics. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, carries the genetic heritage of an organism. Genome is the sum of all genetic information about an organism that is carried on chromosomes. Mutations represent the creation of a new allele for a gene. Okay. Homozygous represents a fertilized egg that receives the same allele for a specific trait from each parent. Heterozygous represents a fertilized egg that receives different alleles for a specific trait from each parent. Mitosis, okay, so for example, homozygous as a fertilized egg, it's like for your eye color, I got brown eyes from my dad and brown eyes from my mom. I have brown eyes, right? That's homozygous. Heterozygous is my mom has brown eyes and my dad has black eyes, and that's two different traits for the same two different alleles for the same trait. Okay. So yeah, mitosis is the way that body cells replicate themselves, which is like cutting your hand. When you cut your hand, your skin cells and all that stuff will reproduce by making copies of itself. Meiosis, however, is the process by which sex cells replicate themselves, which is very different because they combine and cut themselves in half. That is making a baby. Okay, so different types of ways in which cells form. Okay. All right, let's talk about mutations. Mutations is the creation of a new allele for a gene when the portion of the DNA molecule to which it corresponds to is suddenly altered, right? Like lactose. So, funny enough, if you grow up drinking milk or drinking lactose, you will develop the enzyme to digest lactose. If you grow up without drinking milk, you will not develop the enzyme to digest lactose. Okay. Genetic mutation is random, but may produce traits that make an organism better adapted and likely to produce more offspring. Okay, so mutations happen all the time. Whether or not they become adaptations depends on whether or not it's useful for that species' survival in that environment. All right, let's keep moving on. Evolutionary theory hasn't been tested since Darwin. Contemporary biologists recognize that evolution is a complex phenomenon that requires theoretical pluralism recognize that a variety of okay. What this slide is basically saying is that evolution, even though we were pretty confident that this is how things go down, there is a possibility that it's different, right? And I remember how we talked about how archaeology, the research always changes. It's not often that the research actually changes. It's just in fact that we found different things and it means different things, right? But this is just basically saying to keep an open mind because things are not always what they seem. For a while, we thought evolution was just like the Darwinian notion of evolution, but as we move on, we kind of have more evidence for the Lamarckian style of evolution. Whatever it is, just keep an open mind. This is what this slide is saying. Not important. Okay, good. So full circle, right? So what are some key points of Darwin's perspective, right? This is this slide right here. Okay, variational evolution, theory of common origin, and theory of evolution by natural selection, right? Basically, the first thing, animals are different. How are they different? Okay, and that is what defines species. Do these species have a common ancestor? And finally, how do new species go come about, and how do old species go extinct? It's through natural selection, right? Which is the process of surviving and then procreating. Okay, those are the three important characteristics that make Darwin's perspective special. All right. So real quickly, again, the reflection I bumped it up to be due on Saturday. The final exam is available from Thursday to Monday, and extra credit is due on Tuesday. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cuny.edu.